Could a masked vigilante exist in today's society, fighting crime and injustice? And by trying to achieve superhero status ourselves, what can we learn to become better humans? This is the Vigilante Superstar Podcast.
Hey, James, welcome to the Vigilante Superstar Podcast.
Matt, how are you? Good to see you again.
Yeah, we crossed paths on a little movie project that I'm working on with the same title as this podcast. And what drew me to you was, A, that you were close by, but also that you run a Bujinkan, I can never say it right, a studio in Chicago, which we'll talk about, but that is closely related to, well, sort of related to Ninjitsu. People might know that a little bit more commonly. But welcome to the podcast. And could you maybe just spend a couple minutes talking a little bit about you and your background, kind of maybe why I would have this conversation with you, what kind of brings your expertise to the table? Go ahead.
I'm a writer, a teacher, a trainer. I've been practicing martial arts. I think this is my 43rd year practicing martial arts, if I get that right. If I get the math on that right. And I used to live in Japan for several years. I came back about 25 years ago, and since then, I opened a studio and was just trying to really proliferate the word, try to figure out my own place in training and figure out what I needed to know and understand about this stuff, and then try and pass it on as best I could as it was passed on to me. And since then, I really dove into the philosophical side. I got a master's degree in ethics. I wrote a book, The Protector Ethic, and that came out in 2018. And since then, I've written several other books. In fact, I just finished up a novel, my first thriller, and I'm shopping that around.
Cool.
And I'm trying to make that work. So there's a bunch of different things that are kind of happening, and there's things happening behind the scenes a little bit. Got some things in the fire I'm waiting to hear on. So hopefully something will pop there.
Well, congratulations on the books, because I know what it's like to complete a long project. You've done it multiple times, but yeah, congrats. Hopefully that goes well for you. So what brought me to you initially was, and I actually went to your dojo in Chicago, was part of the movie is about, could a Batman type character exist? And one of the ways that it's approached in the Christopher Nolan movies is that he studies to be a ninja, essentially. And so I was looking around for a ninja, in quote, if you can't see me, air quotes. And they're not super common to find. And I know that when we talked on the phone, you were kind of like, we don't like that term very much. Like, we don't love, if I'm remembering that right, you were kind of like, yeah, we practice this martial art. We don't really like to be known as ninjas, but I think it's part of it's part of the conversation. It's kind of a fun conversation. And I actually learned a ton from you in the hour I was with you, hour and a half. So you, if I'm getting this right, I think you're a pretty high ranking I always say this wrong. It's Bujinkan.
Yeah,
Bujinkan. Okay. Practitioner. I believe you're like a 10th Dan. Is that correct?
It goes higher than that, but basically I have all the ranks.
Okay.
It's the ranking in Bujinkan is slightly different than other schools. Just like it's slightly different in a lot of different ways from other schools.
So the kind of funny part of that conversation was, I was like, are you a ninja, James? And you're kind of like, well, because there's a lot to that, and there's a lot of historical. So why don't you talk a little bit about, just for people listening, what is that martial art specifically? I think it's part of, I'm going to try to remember this correctly, I think there's 9 disciplines. Am I getting that right? Underneath just the banner of Bujinkan?
Yeah, the way that I kind of explain it to people is like this. Modern martial arts look like karate or taekwondo or judo or something like that. They're all kind of separated out. Like, this is a kicking art. This is a grappling art. Here's kendo, which, deals with swords and things like that.
Right.
Back in the day in Japan, hundreds of years ago, there was not that separation. So if a school, or rather a lineage, was considered a school, it did all of those things, probably in different ways. They grappled, they kicked, they punched, they used weapons. Sometimes they specialized. Sometimes they specialized in swords. So you'd get like more of a sword-based school. Sometimes they specialized in spear. So you get a spear uh, school. The issue then was that people would cross-train in these different schools under people who were licensed to teach those various lineages. And then you could get a license as a samurai or a warrior and say, look, I've got, this school and this school and this school, and it would become part of your pedigree. It would become
Okay.
part of your aspects of being a warrior. So when you go and applied for a job somewhere, you could say, look, I have all these things and show everything up.
Yeah.
What the Bujinkan is it's descended from a fellow named Takamatsu. Hatsumi is actually the progenitor of the school. Masaki Hatsumi is the guy who he founded the school in the early 70s, but he was studying under this man, Takamatsu. And Takamatsu is the man who inherited these various schools and had this really storied life. He, traveled to China and did all this crazy stuff like the death dueling, the bodyguarding, fighting with swords, all this kind of stuff. Comes back to Japan and in his early 70s meets a very young man who was in his mid-20s, Hatsumi. And Hatsumi is really interested in what Takamatsu knows and how he knows it.
Mhm.
And after an initial meeting, Takamatsu says, "Okay, you're not so much of a nerd. I'll take you on and teach you what I know." Well, this begins this 15-year relationship between the two of them, and where Takamatsu essentially passes on everything he knows to Hatsumi.
Okay.
And then Hatsumi takes that, begins his own group, starts to pass this on in these various ways. What accounts for the ninja or the ninjitsu part of this is that some of the schools that Takamatsu inherited are supposedly descended from these ninja type traditions. Not all of them, but some of them. And they're quite esoteric, quite frankly. I mean, they deal with weather prediction, strategy, some
Yeah.
tactics in terms of maybe battlefield strategy or things like that. Every once in a while, they'll touch on something that's much more, um, oh, like personal, like individualized, like certain weapons, like you've seen the climbing claws, not really
Right.
climbing claws, but they're like, claws
Right.
you wear in your hands to catch swords or something.
Mm.
Shuriken, which is the throwing blades
Right.
that are highly associated. Many people use those, not they weren't all ninja. Uh, and there were other things like that, like
Yep.
dark kinds of weapons and things. And so they, hundreds of years ago, Shinobi no Mono, which is what they were really known as, proliferated themselves as being intelligence gatherers. They were kind of guerrilla warfare fighters, things like that,
Mhm.
and really were very good at their job. They were kind of a counterculture to the samurai culture as it was known back then. And they were really at their height in maybe like the mid 1500s or late 1500s. And then there was some internal strife. There was this kind of great civil war at the time. Oda Nobunaga was rolling through the countryside and killing off all these folks. And but they were kind of a threat in the sense that they were very, very good at what they knew how to do.
Mhm.
Lay siege to castles, sneak in, cause havoc, things like that. Collecting intelligence, and these network of spies were all over the place, and so it really became a kind of very storied history,
Yeah.
and that's where it's descended today in how people think about this stuff. And you have these buzzwords today like, oh, he's so ninja about X, Y, or Z, because now it's like you're a prolific expert in whatever X.
Yeah.
And so it really becomes a very interesting way to think about things. In terms of the training that we do, because the schools, as they're known, covered all kinds of weaponry, all kinds of means and ways of moving, tactics and strategies about how to think about conflict and whatnot. And what we've done today is kind of update, instead of being about sneaking around and battlefield practicality or something. What you're really talking about today is the individual and how to make the individual better by introducing them to means and ways to deal with conflict. And like, like I wrote about, to become a protector,
Right.
become a protector of yourself and extend that to others, whether it's people that you know and love or strangers or even your enemy, if you can.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I wanna move on to other topics, but I think a couple fascinating things I think you told me. We see these movies like Ninja Assassin, and we think of these, like, superhuman fighters, and how really that's been very Hollywoodized. They were more like, I think you said they would sneak into a castle, they wear peasants' clothes to gather intelligence, they would lay in one position for a long time to wait,
Sure.
they weren't necessarily, and they would wear dark blue. We always picture them in black, because navy blue or dark blue actually blended with the night better. There was a lot of fascinating things in there, um, and, it's obviously really, I know when I was growing up in the '80s, I'm sure you remember some of those really
Yeah.
cheesy, just, bad blood, really ridiculous ninja movies that always had the same actors, and they were fun in the '80s. I remember they were really cool to watch in the '80s because of this mysterious, almost superhuman fighters, but more almost like, I guess, espionage, spy, probably could fight, right, and take care of
Yeah.
themselves and new weapons, but really were like, "Hey, we need to know how many men there are in this army. We need to know what siege weapons they have. We need to know, and
Is anyone sick?
is anyone
Is
sick? Is
there
there a plague? Is
Yeah.
there whatever?" Yeah, that's fascinating stuff. Okay, so let's move on to a couple other things. So we're not, because we could probably talk about that all day. Um, so you're big, even philosophically, on just being a protector. I mean, that's kind of I think you do some de-escalation stuff with police, and you've taught some of those things. If I'm getting that right, in society right now, I think what I'm seeing, you're seeing it too. I think people are becoming more and more shy to intervene, to become protectors. Why do you think, I guess, now, even compared to 50 years ago, when I think, if I can say this right, maybe men were more willing to stand up? I feel like now we have a tiny part of the population that's served in the military. We have a lot of people who don't know what it's like to serve other people. We're a very selfish, self-consumed society. But what do you think is the reason why we're not seeing, when things happen, in cities, or someone's on the subway or someone's in an alley, like, why are people so hesitant now to stand up?
Well, I tend to look at these kinds of this is a big question.
I know, I know. Try to consolidate it if you can.
Yeah. It has, I think, a big answer, which is that everything is connected
Yeah.
in these various ways. The takeaway, I think, is this. There's lots of reasons not to stand up and protect people when they need to be protected, which is when they can't protect themselves. There's lots of reasons not to do that.
Mhm.
But the reason to do that outweighs all of that.
Okay.
And when you get someone with three components, I've been sort of harping on this of late, because I think it's these three components that basically make up, at least from a martial perspective, they're very, very important. Clarity,
Okay.
competence, and courage.
Okay.
To me, those three aspects are really preeminent. They're kind of the core values of, if you were going to look at a triangle of empowerment or something like that. You need clarity to know why you ought to be doing something.
Mhm.
You need competence to know that you can achieve what you're about to set out to achieve.
Right.
And most importantly, you need courage. You need the courage of your clarity
Mhm.
and the courage of your competency in order to step up and say, yes, I'm going to deal with this.
Yeah.
I think I I would say over the last 10 years, we've seen a lot of problems
Mm.
in just dealing with the United States.
Yeah.
We've seen a lot of issues
Mhm.
with the country and a lot of bad actors, people misbehaving.
Mhm.
And the biggest concern that I think, or at least one of the biggest concerns, is that I've seen the breakdown of the rule of law
Mhm.
in a lot of different ways. And one of the worst ways is that when people break the law, they're not held accountable for it.
Right.
And when there's no accountability for that, when people feel like there's no justice,
Mhm.
people step back. They step back, they huddle up with the people who are closest to them, and they say to each other, keep your head down.
Mm.
And I think that's what happens. And it's not always like when you hear these things, it doesn't always make national news.
Mm.
Sometimes it does, like this case in New York where the guy choked out that guy on the subway.
Daniel Penny.
And,
Marine.
right.
Yeah.
And, where is that going to go?
Right. We don't
Did he deserve to be prosecuted or not?
know. Mhm.
There are other things that you see more online where videos hit and people make a claim. There was a big stabbing thing in a river a while back. I think it was somewhere in like Minnesota, or I can't remember exactly where. And a bunch of people rushed to uh, a bunch of people rushed to defend this guy who had been getting pushed around by some teenagers and pulled out a knife and started stabbing them. And at least one of them died.
Mhm.
And when I saw the video and I'm reading the comments like, this man defended himself, I took one look at that video and said, this guy is going to jail.
Mhm.
I knew instantly that like this was so there's lots of different reasons that people have
Mm.
for not standing up. But you only need one good reason to do it.
Yeah.
And oftentimes you have to listen to your gut. You've got to think to yourself like, is this really going to do what I think it's going to do? Or am I going to make this worse?
Mhm.
And this is where the training comes in.
Right.
And it's not just martial arts training that I'm talking about. You standing up a lot of times nowadays doesn't even involve getting physical with
Mhm.
people, but it does involve conflict.
Yeah.
And conflict freaks people
Yeah.
out.
Yeah.
They don't like they don't
agree.
like to have to defend their ideas. They don't like to have to defend themselves in
Yep.
terms of what they want to say and all this other kind of stuff. And the issue there is very clear. If you have not trained your brain
Right.
to think in particular ways. I lost you there for a second.
We're back.
Yeah.
Okay. Go ahead.
You have not trained your brain and your mouth to think and speak in particular ways, and you go off half-cocked on something because you're so upset about it or emotional, you may get a lot of pushback.
Yeah.
You find that people don't appreciate that. So, I remember years ago, I was in a verbal judo. I took a verbal judo course and got certified in that by the guy who had written the program, Thompson, sheriff for many, many years. And he came up with this program. Verbal judo is a way to speak to people, to de-escalate and get them to comply with you. And it's basically centered around law enforcement
Yeah.
and people in crisis. So they're approaching this person. This is the worst day of their lives. They need someone to speak reasonably to them.
Mhm.
How do I do that so that you don't jump off this building? Or in his case, they would bring him in to negotiate for hostage rescue, things like that. He talked about being brought in because a father was holding his child at knife point because he thought his child had been possessed by the devil. And he wanted a priest to come in and exorcise. And that's what they did. They went and got a priest. He comes in, does this thing, and the guy let the kid go, and nobody had to die. So it's things like that. It's a very interesting. But his take on it was this: of the 100% that you are going to use a verbal judo, only 8%, like this much, was what you said to people, the words you actually spoke. 8% was that. 92% was your tone. It was the manner with which you approached, spoke, your body language, the whole thing of it. When people are in crisis or when they're criminals, their mindset is skewed.
Yeah.
And so how you approach them and the way that you spoke to people made an enormous difference. Even if you didn't quite know which words to say. And I think that's what I see as an issue in today's world, where we're all talking about free speech, we're all talking about the First Amendment. Everybody's trying to get the words right, but the way that they say it is all over the place.
Yeah, that's good.
It's too emotional.
Yeah.
Got to bring it down. Got to center yourself, whatever. Take some deep breaths. And then try to speak more reasonably in a tone that you would appreciate to be spoken to.
Yeah, that's good.
And I think that's part of the problem that we're experiencing.
Oh, it's a huge problem. People can't have conversations.
Yeah.
So, okay. So part of the podcast, the fun part, the water cooler conversation is, a character like Batman, right? And so I've kind of steered most of the conversation a little bit toward that. I think, to your point, and this came up last podcast episode as well. I think if society continues to degrade into more lawlessness, I think you're going to see in a not so good way people rising up and becoming overly violent to counteract what they perceive as threats to them. And then you get into a really dangerous kind of almost Wild West type situation where, people can't de-escalate with words, so they take action
Or votes.
Or votes, yeah.
And that's another concern.
Well, right. I mean, look how politically we're divided right now. I mean, today is election day, and it's, people are, they hate each other just for their beliefs. And I think 20 years ago, I've lived long enough to know people didn't think that way. There was a lot of cross belief. There was a lot of senators who cross believe. Now it's so, so much more purple. And now it's just boom, and there's very little. And I think people are starting to mimic that rhetoric, and that's dangerous because I think, of course, and this brings up other parts that we probably don't have time to get into, but in talking to a lawyer, you really have to be careful about, what if let's say your family's threatened, you're on a subway, the Daniel Penny story, how far can you go? It has to be force equal force, so if someone's just maybe getting threatening, you really are you can only push them away or maybe de-escalate with words. And then, but we all know if your family was in jeopardy, serious jeopardy, and there's a metal pipe there, right? Or a weapon, you're going to pick it up and you're going to do some damage to protect your family and ultimately probably get in trouble for that. And you're just doing what you feel like you have to do. And I feel like society as a whole, that's probably already happening. We just don't hear about it. But if you live in a neighborhood that's very dangerous and you see some people threatening your family, I'm sure violence creates violence. And so certainly not advocating that, in this Batman discussion too, but I think that's all part of it. So to kind of move this a little bit that way, so Batman is the most grounded he's a billionaire and he's got all these crazy gadgets, but he's just a trained guy who spent, I've looked this up, of course, in the Christopher Nolan movies, it's 7 years, but most like comic people say, 10 to 12 years of training, which mathematically that puts him at almost 30 by the time he's becoming Batman, right? But why I mean, why do you think we haven't seen somebody like this? I mean, what would it take to be someone like that? I mean, obviously, this person's larger than life. They have to have some of the physical traits. I mean, training's great, but I think if you're built like a cross country runner, I think it's a harder path. And how do you think it would realistically look in society now with all of the cameras and social media and GPS tracking? And I mean, what do you think? I have my opinions based on a lot of interviews, but
Yeah.
what do you think? Why hasn't someone like this risen up like a Robin Hood in a type of neighborhood? I mean, one more thing. I know we have people. Who's the major crime boss in Colombia? He was the
Oh,
show Narcos is made on him.
oh yeah.
Escobar.
Yeah.
Pablo Escobar. So
Yeah.
he was beloved. Horrible guy, like horrible guy, but he was beloved by some of those communities, and it has that kind
Yeah.
of
So was Al
Robin.
Capone.
Yeah, Al Capone as well. I mean, and it, people that he would give to people, he would help people,
Yeah.
but he would also murder people. You know?
Yeah.
But there's a more extreme situation of like extreme vigilantism, like, oh, we're poor, so we're gonna do this, we're gonna take this, we're gonna take it back. But again, why don't you think we see more people like this? And as a extension to that, what would it take to get there? I mean, that's a whole nother part of the conversation.
I think it would be, I mean, just to approach it from a kind of blank slate standpoint, my feeling is this. Let's say you identify something in your midst, your neighborhood, your community, whatever, and you say to yourself, this is really awful. This is really bad. And it needs to be dealt with, and no one's dealing with it.
Mhm.
What would you do, and how would you do it? And I think the answer there, and you've seen this in other places around the country and around the world, where people take it upon themselves to start documenting,
Mhm.
to start recording, to surreptitiously or covertly record people, get them on video, so that something that was terribly obscure now is that you've shed daylight on.
Mhm.
And there is that part of it. And I think that someone who was going to take on the mantle of this would probably have to wind up doing that in some way. They'd
Mhm.
have to collect enough intelligence, video, audio, whatever, photos, evidence, in order to then move
Mhm.
in a more particular action oriented direction, whatever that is, whether it's just exposing it, sending it off to the press,
Right.
who is going to publish it, or just getting it out, releasing it worldwide on the web, or something along those lines. Or in like a Batman case where he says, okay, here's the fulcrum point of all this, and here's what it's predicated on. I'm going to attack that point covertly in extreme with extreme action,
Mhm.
and I'm going to disguise myself and all this kind of thing, and cause maximum damage to whatever this, to bring it down, to stop it,
Mhm.
any of this other kind of stuff.
Like a ninja.
Like a ninja,
Right,
right?
right, right.
But whether you could actually do that and remain
Mhm.
anonymous, I think is a very tall order, especially in this day and
Yeah,
age.
I agree.
I think that would be very, very difficult. I'm not saying it's impossible, because people obviously have done it.
Well, and you have sorry to interrupt. You have criminals that get away with stuff and never get
Oh
caught.
yeah,
So it can be done. It's just criminals tend to be a couple steps ahead of the good guys typically. But yeah, to kind of agree with your point, in talking to a lot of guys who actually served in the military, in special forces, who had done
right.
covert missions, the general consensus when I would ask this question, which it was fun to ask those guys this question, they would say, "Well, I think you could do it. I think you could do it for a year or two,
Mm,
and then you would either get really hurt, dead,
yeah,
or you would get discovered, and it
right,
would be extremely, again, you're dead on, extremely intel based. Like, you're not gonna be just, like, sitting on like, in the comics, he's sitting up on a fire escape, and he's like, "Oh,
right.
bank robbery. I'll stop that. That just would never happen.
On patrol and
Crime, yeah, you're not going to patrol a metropolis like Chicago or Baltimore and find. You'd have to probably have a team, even if it's like 2 people, just finding you where crap's going to go down. So you're there and you go attack that warehouse. It would be almost just like how the SWAT team or a tactical team would do. It'd be just like how these special forces guys, like tons of intel, drone in the sky, guy in the van, comms in the ear.
Yep.
And then on top of that, then you would have to be a very special, trained human being.
Yeah.
Like in that James Bond caliber, of
Sure.
that person. So I think you're like dead
with
on.
balls of steel.
With
I mean,
that,
they're
yeah. I
really
mean, like
creepy.
so many people. Like I think if I had to save my family, I would intervene. I think if I was trying to stop a crime in a drug warehouse down the street, you would have to absolutely just. You'd have to have. First of all, be brilliant to tactically plan that, but then be like everything has to go right, and you have to have a million ways out, and there's
And it
so
never
many
goes right.
factors. No, and it never goes right. And then with special forces, they were like, if something goes sideways, we leave. We just go.
Mhm.
We stop. We don't continue the mission.
Right.
So I think you'd have to have that training, which I think would take a really long time.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a fun conversation, but again, that's why it's so fantastical, right?
Yeah.
Because it's like we have guys that can do this in little slivers, little pieces
For
for a night or a week or something, right? But then it gets crazy. But yeah, I mean, what would be kind of if you were doing it, like what would be your dream scenario in terms of training team, equipment? Like where would you even start?
I mean, it depends. It depends what your overall purpose is.
Yeah.
I mean, Batman was always famous for preserving life, no matter whose life
Right.
it was. And in some ways, it's rather unrealistic because you can't throw a shuriken or a dart or something and hit the guy's hand and all that. I mean, all of that's rather, but I think you could, if you used certain tactics or strategies to drive people to certain actions or whatever, then you could maybe achieve your goal in a little bit different way.
Right.
So trying to get them to assist you in that sense with whatever it was that you were, I like if you cause a distraction outside and everybody runs out, it's like, now this is open, this is where I need to get to, whatever.
Yeah.
It's just a very simplistic way of thinking about it. But if you, nobody wants, I don't think anybody really wants to be the Punisher.
No. And I think the second you do that,
in your sense, because I think it's psychopathic, but
I think you just end up becoming the worst of the worst if you do something like that. I think the only way to do it would be to be like Batman. Like I don't want to be like the criminal, but I want to stop the criminal. And I think you're right. I mean, even all the scenarios, that you just never see in the comics. You punch a guy, you knock him out, but he hits his head on a curb and he's dead. So it's like, I didn't mean to kill the guy, but like you just killed someone. So I think it's really, but I think you're right. It would almost have to be back to our ninja conversation. A lot of the special forces guys, like they work at night. They work with night vision. It's one of the great force multipliers. They have equipment that nobody else has. They can smoke you out. They can look through walls. They can look under doors. They have all this stuff. And then they come in with it's like shock and awe. And I guess the premise for like when you kick a door in, it's all about speed. So everything has to be done so quickly. But, there's a lot of things that have been around like flashbangs and smoke grenades and tear gas pellets. And you could literally put down a whole room of people in about 2 seconds and not have to do anything. So
all of that is available on the civilian market.
You can go to Amazon and get it. I mean, and my son last year was funny. He was former Army and he's a real practical guy and he wants to be safe. So he built a bug out bag and he's got all this stuff in this bug out bag that would protect from a lot of scenarios. And he doesn't have a firearm, but he's got literally a tear gas grenade, costs like $60 that you can throw into a bad situation and everybody's going to scatter. And so
Yep.
he has that with him a lot and all the time, you know? So I think there's ways to do it. I think it's just a fun conversation. I know realistically it's more probably in the clandestine military and CIA Secret Service type world, but
Yeah.
it wouldn't surprise me if with all the technology in the next 30 years, if we saw something like this. Um, any last thoughts on that? Because we're gonna kind of close it out here with a couple last thoughts. But
I think there's plenty of gear out there that's worth having.
sure,
Uh, I mean, you know, if you're gonna carry weapons on you, and that's really the best force multiplier. If you're gonna carry weapons, whether that's knife or a firearm or some other kind of specialized thing, which now you start to get off map on
Yeah.
with that stuff a little bit. You need training.
Yeah.
As this is the part of that conversation that people are yeah. It's kind of, it's like, yeah, you need to get in shape.
hmm
Yeah, you should be in shape. You
Yeah.
should be metabolically healthy
yeah,
if you're gonna do these kinds of things and commit to carrying this kind of stuff. And you should know the law.
Yeah.
And you should, and if you are willing to intervene in things like that, and maybe you are, and maybe you're not, because nobody really knows that until that moment occurs.
Yep.
You've got to be very careful with
Yeah.
how you do that and how you proceed.
hmm
There are plenty of instances where people have stopped real world violence,
Yep.
whether with their hands or with a weapon. There's plenty of instances. There's way more instances of people by their presence alone or brandishing a weapon or something like that have, stopped violence from occurring.
Yeah.
So that's not well charted, but there's plenty of them out there, at least
Mhm.
anecdotally, that we know of. So there's a real balance that you need to strike between what I'm going to do and how I'm going to do it.
Mhm.
It's tough sometimes to say it. So it's a longer conversation.
Absolutely, absolutely. And like you said, I mean, the neighborhood watch has proven to be pretty effective in some communities. Just getting everyone on the same page, like, hey, we're going to look out for each other. That can be pretty powerful. I know there's been groups like the Guardian Angels; those have come up a few times. The intent is good. Sometimes they have good results. Sometimes it's gone a little over the top, and people have gotten hurt. Same with the police. The police do their absolute best, but it's an extremely dangerous job with high stress, and they do their absolute best to not hurt people, but sometimes it happens.
Chicago cop was just killed.
Yeah,
He was
last
just
night.
killed.
I just heard that. Yeah. It's an incredibly people say, oh, the cops are not handling these situations correctly. I've seen where they've on the news brought in people who are anti-cop, and they said, okay, here's a scenario. And what do those people do? They pull the trigger, they start shooting
Yep.
because they panic. And so it is a really hard job to do.
So everybody wants to live in a high trust society.
Sure, of course.
Everybody wants to live. I live in a small town where when you go to the grocery store, people leave their windows down on their car.
Right.
I mean, and the thing about that is what's interesting is that there's a protector ethic involved in that, because yes, I'm going to protect your car as I'm walking past it, and I'm going to make sure that there's no one lurking around it or something like that, but I'm also protecting your car from me.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I'm not going to go in and rummage through your car right now, because I know that I'm not going to do that, because in this place, that's not allowed.
Yeah.
You're not seeing that in urban centers.
Wow.
Urban centers are low trust societies.
That's good. Good.
Everybody's fearful. Chicago's basically fallen.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Brandon Johnson now has 12 people? I just saw on Chicago, what is it? Chicago Critter. They said that there's 12 people who have died or been shot because Brandon Johnson got rid of the shot spotter.
Yeah.
Because that shot spotter was pointing out there's been gunshots in this area. No one has called 911. It automatically calls the police. The police show up, and here's a body.
Mm-hmm.
riddled with bullets that no one that would have been here until the next day because nobody called 911.
Yeah.
And so, I mean,
Yeah.
so we're, and that goes back to kind of what we were saying earlier about, you know, what it takes to stand up and be a protector. Like, nobody wants to call the police because nobody wants to give their name. Nobody wants to be known, but this is a low trust society. That's not going to happen where I'm at. You're going to get 20 people because they know that, you know, and if they're, you know, and they're going to be out there probably with, you know, with their own guns, waiting for the cops.
Right.
You know? So
Yeah.
anyway, it's just an interesting.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, in closing, just to kind of wrap this up, good discussion. So in kind of going on this journey, you know, everyone that I've talked to, you know, and I'm going to say this with big air quotes, but, you know, in trying to achieve like a superhero status, you know, how it can really make people better. And like, I think you've already really talked about some of these. It's like your mentality, your training. What would be some things that I think by trying to achieve these levels that maybe a Batman, again, in quotes, trying to achieve, what he would have to do to become a master in these things? What are some of those things that would just make us better people? I mean, I think you've hit on a few of these things already in this conversation. And when I talked to you earlier, that stuff came up a lot. But what can we do to become better people through that
Well,
process?
I'll give you two things that people could do today.
Mm-hmm.
One of those things is an action, and one of those things would be study, right?
Yeah.
The action is be aware of your presence. In other words, start taking stock of making yourself a part and making yourself seen in certain moments. Because it's oftentimes the presence of someone else who won't leave. You know, something's going on, something's happening, and everybody just kind of goes like this, you know?
Or starts filming.
And yeah. I don't know if I told this story, but many years ago, I was on a bus and I was just coming home from work and I'm reading a book and the bus is doing what buses do, which is be loud and obnoxious and the engine is roaring and all this other kind of stuff. And none of that bothered me because people are talking on their phones and they're having conversations and all this other kind of stuff. It was the middle of the afternoon. And then suddenly I realized that all of that had stopped, ceased. No more talking. People hung up their phones. They got quiet. And that set off my radar. And I went, what the hell is going on? And it turned out there were two guys at the front of the bus having an argument. In fact, it really wasn't an argument. It was an interaction.
Okay.
Did I tell this story? I don't remember if I did.
I don't remember the story now.
One guy, they're on opposite sides of the bus and they're looking at each other like this. One guy is making faces at the other guy who is clearly like not all there.
Yeah.
And the other guy is watching this guy make faces at him and he is freaking out. He is screaming at the top of his lungs like, you know, F you, screw you. And, you know, I mean, like he's spitting mad. And they keep going. And this, like the bus driver didn't say anything. This goes on for like minutes at a time. And it's clear that the guy who's yelling at the face maker is going to blow his top, get up and, you know, murder this guy, whatever it was. So here I am sitting in my seat. I'm like, ugh. I get up, walk to the front of the bus, and I just stood there right in between their line of sight.
Interesting.
And I just opened my book and I just kept reading. And now they're doing this. They're like, you know, he's making all these crazy faces, like, you know, whatever. I mean, it was like bizarre. And the other guy's just like, you know, screw you, blah, blah, blah. But now they're like moving around me. And I just stayed there, read the book. I just kept reading. And pretty soon it started to diminish
Mm-hmm.
until it finally stopped.
Yeah.
But I had to stay there and block these two from getting. And so by presence alone,
Yeah, that's good.
it was enough to stave off whatever this weirdness was.
Yeah, that's
They're
really good.
both goofs. So that's the first thing. Like, be aware of just how important your presence can matter in a
Just-
certain moment.
Yeah,
Right?
really good.
That's the first thing. The second thing is start training yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And that's literally what it is, by listening to people who are speaking about concerns that are important to you, listening to people who are smart and articulate, speaking about concerns that are important to you. In other words, learn how to speak articulately about the values that you value. And if you learn to do that, you can have intelligent conversations. You can bring down the rhetoric,
Mm-hmm.
the temperature of rhetoric. You can start to probe people and ask interesting questions,
Yeah.
and actually try to bridge the divide between people.
That's
But
good.
you have to train yourself to do this. This is not unlike, I mean, there's so much information out there. People could literally become PhDs with the amount of material out there just by studying,
Yeah.
reading books, studying how people are having these conversations
Mm-hmm.
about the values that matter. And they affect all of us. All of these different values affect us in myriad ways.
Yeah.
They're important.
Yeah.
And as we move forward here, we're going to need more people to be able to have better conversations, because that's the only thing that everybody's, oh, it's like, well, we need to have a conversation about this or a conversation. Yeah, but it just evolves into screaming,
Yep. That's good.
between people who are not trained in order to have those conversations. So you need to bring this down, and you need to train yourself. And the best way to do that is to, again, what values matter to you,
Mm-hmm.
and who do you trust to speak honestly,
Mm-hmm.
accurately, and articulately about these concerns.
That's
And if you
good.
do that, and you watch that, you really can train up and sound a lot better.
And probably make a difference in your little circle as well. Yeah, and I think too, just you train your mind, you train your body. I mean, you're an older guy like me, like you are fit, you know how to take care of yourself, you have studied martial arts for all these years, you're disciplined. So I think a lot of those things can benefit. I mean, even just going through this process, like I'm 51, I have this incredibly strong desire since I started this process. I've tried CrossFit, I've lost some weight. I really want to take up boxing. I want to like learn some of these just in case, but even the discipline of just learning it is going to make me better. Cause I think, and I'll say this in closing, but I think I read somewhere that people generally have a baseline happiness. Even we kind of always resort to it's called, I think is it heuristics? I can't remember, but it's like we have baseline happiness. And really what makes us truly happy is learning a new skill and having a new experience. Like those are the things that truly like elevate your happiness, as opposed to I'm going to buy those pants or I'm going to get a new cool car. It's not that stuff. It's like learning kind of what you're doing, and to live a fulfilled life, to become a better person is, yes, sure, we can train to be protectors and just in case, especially with the world decaying a bit. But yeah, also just educate yourself and learn new skills, like learn a new thing this year. I think all those things can be better. So
Yeah, and mentoring.
mentoring, yeah, teaching.
Like really,
Yep.
like if you're good at something, there is someone else out there somewhere who wants to know what it is that you do and how you do it, and bringing that to them, and again, like sharing that with them. That is a great joy. And then it's one of the reasons that I've probably kept training martial arts.
Yeah.
Is that there's that crazy balance between when you meet your mentors and they impart information to you, something that opens you up to ways of thinking that you didn't think of before.
Yeah.
And then you take that and you bring it back to people that matter to you, and they're like, what did you learn? What was it like? And then you give it to them. It's like, that process,
Yeah.
man, is
Great.
amazing.
That's great. Well, thank you so much for coming on today. As always,
you.
tons of information. That's awesome to hear. And you're like the smartest person I think I know, honestly. Like when it comes to like this kind of stuff, like philosophy, like I talked about, I talk to a lot of people that have knowledge and a skill. I think you really sometimes will even turn the conversation away from, let's not talk about martial arts. Let's talk about the mindset, which I think is awesome. So I appreciate your time. Yeah, it is huge. And I appreciate your time and for jumping on. We'll do it again sometime.
Great. Thank you, Matt.
All right.
Appreciate it.
See ya.
Best of luck with the movie. It's I can't wait to see it.
We're trying.